One of the world's largest jets, the Boeing 747-400, experienced an emergency at 10 kilometers. The pilot's reactions to this situation, which aviation had never experienced before, were of vital importance. The story of Flight 85 is based on official accident reports and eyewitness accounts. 9th of October, 2002. This Boeing was preparing to depart from Wayne County Airport in Detroit, USA, to Narita Airport in Tokyo, Japan. The plane was a 4-engine, double-deck Boeing 747-400. It was also the first 747-400 to be produced, and was the aircraft used for the launch. 386 passengers boarded. Along with 386 passengers, there were 18 flight crews on board, making a total of 406 people on this flight. The pushback has begun and the pilots have received clearance from the controller to taxi to the runway. Northwest Airlines was a well-established company founded in 1926. It was the 6th largest airline in the world. In the mid-2000s, due to financial difficulties, they decided to declare bankruptcy in 2010. Since then, they merged with Delta Airlines. Since it was going to be a long flight, 2 separate flight crews were to operate the flight. There were 2 captains and 2 co-pilots on board. Captain John and co-pilot David were to operate the first half of the flight. Captain John was an experienced Boeing 747 pilot. He was also an instructor pilot on 747s. With 11,000 flight hours, Captain Frank and co-pilot Mike were the other flight crew. The pilots completed their taxi and arrived at the runway. They got clearance for takeoff and powered the engines of the giant jet. When they reached takeoff speed, they took off from Detroit for Tokyo. The trip would take 13.5 hours. About 6 hours passed. The flight was going smoothly. They were halfway through the journey, and the passengers had been served dinner. In the cabin of the plane there is a room and a bed for pilots to rest on such long flights. The captain and his co-pilot told the new crew to let them know before they landed in Tokyo and retired to rest. The plane was cruising over Alaska at 35,000 feet. The plane was passing over the Bering Sea, which currently forms the border between the 2 largest landmasses in the world, Eurasia and the United States. One of the pilots ordered his dinner, completely unaware of what was about to happen. At 5:40 p.m. local time in Alaska, the plane suddenly began to bank to the left, and the bank was 35 to 40 degrees. The pilots were not supposed to reach such a bank under normal conditions. They only went up to this bank during emergency training in the simulator. The passengers knew something was wrong, but they still thought it was severe turbulence. The pilots, who had gone to rest, got out of bed and realized there was a problem. The captain in the cockpit immediately took the plane off autopilot and put the controls on manual. The plane was leaning severely to the left. The pilots were trying to keep the plane flying straight, but the plane was pulling to the left. The pilots initially thought it was an engine failure, but when they looked at the instruments, everything looked normal. So what was the reason for the plane going to the left against the pilot's efforts? You have probably seen that big piece lying perpendicular to the ground on the tails of airplanes. This flight surface, which name is rudder, is vital for every airplane. This part is to ensure the movement of the airplane to the right and left on the yaw axis through the pedals on the pilot's feet. You can understand this movement more clearly as follows. While this flight surface is in one piece in most airplanes, due to the high dimensions of the Boeing 747, the rudder of the airplane consisted of 2 parts, upper and lower. The reason for the left bank of the airplane was that the lower part was stuck 17 degrees to the left. The part stuck to the left would first cause yaw movement, and then roll to the left. While the captain was struggling with the airplane, co-pilot was looking through the flight manual for what to do in such a situation. But since this was the first time such an emergency had occurred, the flight manual did not contain the instructions. They had 6 hours to reach Tokyo. The pilots decided to make an emergency landing in Anchorage, Alaska, which was 2 hours away. They started a right turn. The captain understood that there was a problem with the vertical stabilizer, and the flight computer confirmed the captain's thought by showing that there was a problem with the lower yaw damper. The captain, who had gone to rest, said that he would take over the controls again. He came back to the controls. They were having a hard time controlling. The yoke had become quite heavy. The pilots' legs were cramping as they pushed the rudder pedal on their feet down. At this time, the pilots entered the frequency to inform the controller of the situation and transmitted the Mayday report. But their calls went unanswered, because they were a long way from Anchorage. The nearest airport was 1 hour and 45 minutes away. They had to fly another 1,300 kilometers. Radio stations have a certain distance to receive signals. The plane was in the dead zone because it was between North America and Asia. There was no way the controller could hear them. At this time, another Northwest plane, also in the air, intervened for the pilots, contacted the controller, and informed him that there was a plane in emergency. The tail was pointing one way and the nose was pointing the other way. In aviation, we call this position a slit. You can think of it as a car that is drifting. The pilots were moving the rudder and the elevator in the opposite direction to maintain this position, but they did not realize how damaged the rudder was and the stress on it. A piece of the airplane could have been completely broken off. While in smaller airplanes the stuck rudder does not pose such a big problem, the stuck rudder of an airplane weighing tons causes a great deal of stress on the surface. The captain in the cockpit immediately took the plane off autopilot and put the controls on manually. This flight surface, whose name is the rudder, is vital for every airplane. While the captain was struggling with the airplane, the co-pilot was looking through the flight manual for what to do in such a situation. The pilot's legs were cramping as they pushed the rudder pedal on their feet down, contacted the controller, and informed him that there was a plane in emergency. Since the pilots had never experienced such an emergency before, they contacted another captain who had a lot of experience with the 747 in the center. The captain was also a friend of the instructor pilot who was flying the aircraft, but the pilot on the line could not find any solution to prevent the aircraft from bank. In the meantime, in order to make the passengers aware of this situation, one of the pilots went to the cabin and told them that they were in an emergency, but that they would solve the situation and that they should rest assured. He also told them that they should be ready for an emergency landing. The pilot made everything clear to the passengers. The crew decided to descend from 35,000 feet to 28,000 feet. They managed to bring the plane closer to Alaska. They were within radio range of the air traffic controller, and they managed to communicate with the controller. The captain was going to make perhaps the most critical landing of his life. They didn't know how the plane with the stuck rudder would react during the landing phase, so they wanted to descend and check how the plane would react in slow flight. But the controller initially refused to allow them to descend because of the heavy air traffic. They were passing through one of the busiest areas of the continent. The controller had denied the pilot's request because of the risk of collision with other aircraft if they lost control of the plane. When the captain said they were in an emergency, the controller gave the pilots permission to descend. He cleared other traffic in the area for the emergency aircraft. The pilots descended to 14,000 feet. They lowered the flaps one level to see if there would be a problem during the landing phase. Then they lowered the landing gear. Opening the flaps and landing gear reduced the airspeed. The plane was descending more steadily with the flaps. These small experiments before landing showed that they would not encounter an unexpected aspect of the plane during the landing phase. The plane reacted positively to the flaps and landing gear. The pilots discussed all possible risks among themselves and talked about possible possibilities. They were approaching the runway through the high mountains of Alaska. The co-pilot was opening the throttle levers of the engines on the left to stabilize the airplane, and reducing the power in engines 3 and 4. In this way, the engines providing thrust from the left were steering the airplane to the right, contrary to the disturbed airplane's surface. In this way, they balanced both powers. The approach phase is as important as the landing phase. A stable approach is a precursor to a good landing. A stable approach was very important for this emergency aircraft because the pilots had no chance to pass. They had only one landing. The pilots lined up with the runway and were to land within seconds. After landing, the captain would hand over the controls to the co-pilot, who would control the movement of the front wheel and rudder from another arm, in case the plane went off the runway. One wrong move and they could go off the runway. And in the end, the pilots managed to land the emergency plane firmly but successfully. They stopped the plane in the middle of the runway within seconds. The pilots took a deep breath after the successful landing. 386 passengers were successfully evacuated. The National Transportation Safety Board launched an investigation after the incident. Because there were many Boeing 747s in operation, they had to find the problem and prevent it as soon as possible to avoid another accident. The manufacturer of the aircraft, Boeing, also joined the investigation. Immediately after the incident, they noticed hydraulic fluid leaking from the tail section. When the inspectors examined the rudder, they found that the casting of the power control part had cracked as a result of metal fatigue. The lower rudder deviated sharply to the left as a result of the rupture in the part. The cover of the module had broken off as a result of the cracking. The cause of the cracking was metal fatigue. The material of this material consists of hard and robust components such as aluminum. Under normal conditions, these parts should not have broken in such a short time due to metal fatigue. Although the researchers conducted detailed investigations, they could not find the reason for the breakage of the part. The material used did not seem to be defective. So what caused the metal fatigue in the part? When the investigators looked at the aircraft's historical records, they realized that this was the first Boeing 747-400 to be completed. After the aircraft went out of production, test pilots pushed the aircraft to its limits to determine the airworthiness. They tested the aircraft to check its endurance to the limits. The investigators thought that the first 747 to be delivered may have suffered metal fatigue for this reason and that the part may have worn out. After the accident, it became mandatory to increase the frequency of inspections of this broken part. They also prevented such an emergency from happening again by installing a wedge on the control module. The coordinated work and good communication of the flight crew enabled them to overcome the emergency without any problems. The fact that the captain, who initially experienced the incident, took the plane out of autopilot as soon as the incident occurred was one of the most important factors in not getting into a worse position. In 2015, the aircraft was retired and put on display in the museum. The flight crew was awarded an Outstanding Achievement Award after the incident.